Well, welcome to the Connexus podcast, a bonus episode here with Jason Cusick. Now, Jason is a friend of mine, and I'm really excited to interview him. But I want to just tell you a little bit about him first. He's the lead pastor of Journey of Faith, a church in Southern California. And he was previously pastor of Care Ministries. He oversaw grief, recovery, crisis, counseling. He's also been a board certified hospital chaplain. I know he's got some unique stories from that time. And last year, Jason wrote this book called The Anxiety Field Guide, and it's healthy habits for long-term healing. And it's a hyper practical book. And I had coffee with Jason. We were in Oregon last year. We're part of a cohort together. And I thought, man, this is the guy to have this conversation. So welcome, Jason.
Man, thanks. So I enjoyed the coffee with you and enjoyed the conversation. Some good counsel and commiseration, and I love this series that you're in right now. You're doing great stuff and hitting all the kind of topics that we need for wellness and mental health and spirituality. So thanks for that. That's great.
Well, thanks for doing this. Now, we're going to talk specifically anxiety today, something you and I have had conversations about. So, we've known each other for a number of years now. And in this book, you share really transparently about your journey with anxiety. So just talk to us a little bit about, when did the light bulb go on that, hey, I think anxiety is what I was struggling with? And then kind of how did you know and what did you do from there?
Yeah. So I feel like I grew up with anxiety and dealing with it in a variety of different ways, some unhealthy ways mostly, but it was really when I got into the job that I'm in right now, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, that something happened. I felt like maybe the weight of responsibility of the new job, the life change that came from that. I was dealing with insomnia. My body, I was vomiting. My mind was just going everywhere. And I got to kind of this really dark moment where I was thinking, like maybe I'm not helping the people. I might even be hurting people in my life. And I even, like, a suicidal thought came in, and I had suicidal thoughts in the past, but this kind of came out of nowhere. And I was talking to a friend of mine at the time, and he was like, wait, what is going on? And I was seeing a counselor at one point, and the counselor referred me to this other guy who has a specialty in anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. I met with him, and it was like after 20 minutes, it became clear I was having major anxiety issues and even some latent OCD stuff. And it's like a light bulb came on at that point. Like, oh, there's a name for what I'm dealing with. And not only that, but there's like help. There's like solutions for how to get well. And it was amazing. And I realized, how did I miss this for years? And, fortunately, we're in a culture right now where, like you're doing with your church and what I've done with mine and what we're seeing in the culture, now we're talking about things like anxiety, which is great. So there's a lot of help out there now.
Now, would you say so it sounds like you would say you felt relieved. Is that true? Like, would you say you felt relieved?
Yeah, kind of like, I mean, we've all probably had experiences where we're dealing with stuff, and then somebody says, "Oh, this is what it is." It was like, "Oh, okay, good." I mean, I didn't like the fact that I was dealing with anxiety, but at least I knew, like, there was a way, like, there's something to do with this. It wasn't like, what's going on with me? Nobody's ever experienced this before. Yeah. Right. And I think that's what opened me up to realizing, man, there's actually a lot of research on this and a lot of approaches and techniques to help people. Stuff I hadn't even noticed. I'd never even really heard about.
Now, so talk to me about people who deal with anxiety. In your opinion, what is the thing that people who deal with anxiety actually misunderstand about anxiety? So, somebody gets diagnosed or they're pretty sure they're struggling with anxiety. What is the thing that a lot of people kind of misunderstand about the whole thing?
I can tell you what I misunderstood is I thought it was my fault. I thought it's like, oh, I have anxiety. Like, if I just stopped worrying or stopped thinking about these things or just do better or focus more, then I won't be anxious. The advice of just don't worry. Like, I could never get to that. I was overthinking. So I think there was this transformative moment where I realized something's going on in my brain. And that's where I think some of the neuroscience is really helping us understand that anxiety is something that for those of us with anxiety issues long term, this is something that has formed in us over time. And our brains have now kind of taken over.
Right.
And I think that relieved me of some guilt and some shame, not responsibility. It didn't relieve me of responsibility, but it relieved me of the pressure to have some quick fix, or just simply change how you're thinking and do something different, which hadn't ever worked for me up until that point.
Right.
So it kind of invited me into being, you are responsible for what to do from here. But now let's start having some healthy habits, and let's walk through a process, that can help me get well.
Would you say that, like, just stop being anxious? So there's a part of you that's like, I can't stop. You feel shame about it. You feel like it's my fault. Would you say that's probably the same thing other people misunderstand about anxiety? Like, they meet somebody who's anxious. I don't get it. Like, why don't they just stop being anxious?
Right. I think a lot of it is like, you meet an alcoholic and they say, well, you should just stop drinking.
Right.
Or, oh, you're depressed, you should be happy. And of course, if we extrapolate this spiritually, it would be like meeting somebody who has sin in their life. And then you say, yeah, you should stop sinning. It's like, well, I know that.
Right.
What I need is I need a plan.
Right.
I need to figure out how to get better.
Right. So. Right. Now, when on that note, kind of getting better, taking steps, really interesting approach to your book, The Anxiety Field Guide. It's 27 super short, hyper practical, almost point form chapters. So, I mean, I've read a ton of books on this topic, and you see the neuroscience books, and you see, let me take you through like the theories of anxiety, what psychologists say, integrating the right and left side of your brain, like the prefrontal cortex, all that stuff. But this book, what I like is it is as promised, it delivers. It feels like a field guide. Like, why did you take that approach? Kind of the short, it's like some of the chapters are 3 pages, just so people know. Why take kind of that approach?
So part of it was based on what I went through with counseling. So when I met with my counselor and I was reading books, and I read 20, 30 books on anxiety, and I would open them up and I would read them nonstop because I was anxious. And I would read a whole book, and then I'd put it down, and I'd find a new book, and I'd read through the whole book. And I was just consuming a lot of content, but not really applying it, which is really about how you work through anxiety. So I noticed that what I would do is I would read some really powerful thing, or during a counseling appointment, I get some really powerful thing, and I just write it in my phone. And then what I had is these little segments, these little nuggets of insights. And so when I would get anxious, I'd scroll through my phone and say, which one of these is going to help me? So by the time I went around to write the book, I was like, should I write some kind of long form clinical book? Or should I just do like a Christian devotional? And I thought, well, what if I merge them? And what if I did short chapters that you could just say, here's the skill I need right now. Or, oh, I'm feeling this way. Here's the chapter I want to review. And then it could be easy. You could digest it quickly. And you wouldn't get lost in the consuming a lot of content. And I recommend people read the book chapter by chapter and apply it, and not read the whole thing in one sitting, which is what us anxious people do. Oh, if I could just read this, then I could get fixed. And that's not really how it works.
Yeah, you end up being more, the more you read sometimes, the more overwhelmed you get. The more overwhelmed you get, the more anxious you get. Now you're anxious about your anxiety. You're anxious about your book. Like the whole thing is just doing the exact opposite of what you hope.
Yeah, because one of those skills really, when we're dealing with anxiety, one of the skills we need to, I don't want to say master, but one of the skills we need to get better with is tolerating our impatience and kind of being okay with some uncertainty.
Hmm.
And that means I need to read a little bit, and then I need to sit with it. And if I'm anxious to read more, I need to kind of train myself to be okay with not having to read more.
Right.
And that's a skill to develop. So I thought, if I could teach that skill while you're actually reading the book, then that would be good too, you know?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing there about like I'm gonna read till I get fixed. Like I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
I've got a
I,
shelf full of books over here that is exactly evidence of that. I'm
right,
going to
right.
keep consuming things, or we have that promise of if I just find the answer, if I could just read, maybe this book doesn't have, but this other chapter has the promise that there's an insight that once I get that insight, it'll click and I'll be okay. And so
Yeah,
that just feeds that anxiety, and it,
yeah.
of course, is virtuous because we have a shelf full of books and we go, look what I did. I read all these books, but that's not really how, it's not really how you get better. That's
Right.
not how it works.
Right. I remember my first 3 counseling appointments. He said, so at the end, he was like, okay, so, what do you think? And I said, well, the appointment was great, but when are you going to fix me? Like, and he's like, no,
Right.
you're going to learn to live with this. You're not here for like a quick fix. That's not how this works. It's so interesting how we
You're
just,
like, really? This is where my insurance is going? This is what I'm paying for out of pocket?
right,
Is to tell me I'm
right,
not going to get fixed?
right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, counseling. So you meet a lot of people who go, hey, is it time for me to go actually see a professional? Or is this something kind of, I don't want to say lower level, it sounds diminishing, but it's an amount that like, hey, I can actually learn about this, read online, read a few books, get some techniques, I'm good, versus no, I think I need to see a therapist. I need to make an appointment with a medical professional. What are your thoughts on the line there?
I think it's so subjective, but I think a lot of it is based on even just how distressing is it. I think when
Mm,
it has like negative consequences in your life, if you find yourself preoccupied, if the things you have to do to manage your anxiety are actually taking up a lot of time,
mm-hmm,
um, if you are having problems sleeping, if you're having problems eating or you're overeating, if the people in your life are noticing that you're different or that you're not enjoying your life, I think those are good indications. And again, the good thing about like stuff with anxiety is being able to talk to a professional and let the professional give you some assessment,
mm-hmm.
to be able to say, hey, this is a problem. I remember going to see my normal doctor, and they gave me kind of an anxiety depression worksheet. And I checked off all the stuff, and I was like, ooh, like I didn't even want to turn it in. I was like, this is
Yeah.
not good. And that even
Yeah.
gave me an idea. I went back a couple of years later, and I checked off the things. I was like, wow, I'm doing a lot better. You
Right.
know. So I think when you sense that it's distressing,
Right.
and that level of tolerance for each of us might be different, then
Mm-hmm,
it's something good to get checked out.
mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, that's really helpful. Now, we're going to get to the spiritual side of anxiety as we get as the interview goes on. But some of the stuff that's in this book, I love how it melds the two, the spiritual side and kind of, I'll say the clinical side, let's say that, but the mental
Yeah.
health kind
Oh,
of
good.
practical standpoint, which I think is
Oh,
great.
thanks.
Now, you build it on 4 kind of pillars. So what I'm going to do is kind of get you to walk through these. So I'm going to name what they are, and then we'll do them one at a time, and you can tell me what they look like. Okay. So
Okay.
the 4 pillars are normalization, exposure, habituation, and care. Okay. So let's start with normalization. What is that?
So normalization is where we accept that anxiety is a normal part of life. We the term anxiety is a bit weaponized or villainized,
Mm-hmm.
but anxiety is part of the human experience. Like you walk out in a busy intersection and you walk up to the curb and there's cars going by, you're experiencing anxiety. That's healthy anxiety
Mm-hmm.
or good fear. You walk down a dark street at night in an area you don't trust, you have fear. That's good. That's good. And God designed our bodies in this amazing way to respond to fear. So if you have fear and anxiety, like let's say you're close to a pool or you hear a loud noise, something happens physiologically in your body. Blood rushes to your extremities to allow you to respond. Your renal glands produce adrenaline. Your eyes dilate. You don't have to tell your body to do any of this. Your body just does it right away. That's good anxiety. That's good fear. So that's normal. And that's nothing to be afraid of. It's actually something to be thankful for. Unfortunately, what happens is sometimes we get anxious and it doesn't turn off. You know, you walk up to the intersection, you're like, oh, I better be careful. The cars are coming. And then you walk across the street and then you're down the road. Your eyes go back to the way they were. The blood pressure changes, stuff like that. Some of us, we get anxious and it doesn't turn off. And then others of us, we get anxious and there's nothing to be anxious about. So that's bad fear. That's bad anxiety. But anxiety is normal, a normal, natural process in life. In fact, it can even be a gift. You know, like entertainers. When I go out to speak at church on Sunday, I walk out, and when I get on that stage, my heart's beating a little quicker. I'm a little anxious. I'm a little aware of what's going on. That's nervous energy, and that's good. That helps me speak louder. It helps me be more focused. It helps me be more aware. So normalization is saying, this is what's happening. And over time, we may have developed in our habits as well as in our brain chemistry a propensity to anxiety. And in some ways, our brain just learned to do that.
Right. You've used the term, I've heard the algorithm. Talk about that. I think that's a helpful illustration.
Yeah, I was on TikTok the other day and I happened to run across this video of somebody getting their toenail cut, and it was like a really gross fungal toenail. And I was like, oh, I've never seen this before. I watched it. And then suddenly every video on TikTok was fungal toenail clipping videos. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And so the idea of an algorithm is, if you watch this, then the algorithm will learn this is what you like to watch. And then it will show you more. Our brains operate the same way. We get anxious about something and our brain goes, oh, we're anxious about this thing. I'll remember that. So next time it comes up, I'll make you anxious about this. Also, here's another thing to be anxious about.
Right.
So when you're breaking an algorithm on Google, or you're breaking an algorithm on your news feeds or anything like that, what you're doing is you're retraining the algorithm to pay attention to something new. And that's what's happening with anxiety.
Right. It makes me think of the Amazon. If you like this to worry about, you may also like these three things to worry about. Yeah.
My Netflix is always recommending other stuff to watch. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I'm anxious. So if we were to personalize it, we were going to say, I'm like, oh, I'm really nervous about going to meetings at work. And every time you acknowledge and you carry that anxiety and you frame it as anxiety, your brain goes, oh, we're nervous about work. And so over time, you can actually show up to work and suddenly you're nervous because your brain goes, oh, we're at work. It's time to be nervous.
Right.
And again, that's not your fault necessarily. Your brain has learned something. And now what you can do is retrain your brain. And that's where the next step comes in. So the normalization is
normalization.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's normalization. So then normalization, then exposure is the next one.
Yeah. And exposure is the part we don't like. And that is that anxiety grows through avoidance. So the way to deal with anxiety is to lovingly and strategically face what we fear. We expose ourselves thoughtfully, strategically, and graciously to the things we fear so our brain can relearn, so we can break the algorithm. So every time we avoid what we fear, we're basically telling our brain, or our brain is learning, we are still afraid of this.
Right.
Now, the good part is we all have experience in our life with exposure. I was talking to a group of people the other day, and I was like, hey, what is something you used to be afraid of that you're not afraid of anymore? And the person said, I used to be afraid of dogs when I was a little girl. And I said, are you afraid of dogs now? She was like, no. I said, why not? She said, because I just met more dogs. Yeah, you started hanging around dogs and you got used to being around dogs. And then your brain told you you don't have to be afraid of dogs anymore. Now, you have to be careful with dogs, but you didn't have the anxiety that you had before. In fact, she still does have anxiety about dogs, but it's good anxiety. Because when you're around a wild animal, even a domesticated one, you need to be careful. But that's good fear. So exposure is, what are you afraid of? And then how could you begin moving toward that thing in your mind, maybe at a distance, then maybe actually engaging with it. That's what exposure is.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So, and I think an example of that I've seen people experience is the phone. Somebody leaves me a message at my office. They say, oh, it's probably bad. So they get anxious that it's bad. So then they don't call that person. Then they put it off and then they put it off.
Right.
Now the call's getting harder and harder. They're avoiding instead of exposing. And the way they course correct that is, you know, when they get the call, if they missed a call, as soon as they see they missed it, they pick it up before their brain has a chance to like get too far down the road. Like, I'm just going to kind of give myself some exposure as quickly as I can, you know?
That's a great example. I mean, it's such a practical example. I was doing that where I had meetings that I had to have people with, and I was really nervous about hurting their feelings. Mm-hmm. So I just pushed the meeting off. I remember talking to one guy and he was coaching me through this. And I said, well, I really have to have this meeting with an employee. And I was like, well, I'm really nervous. And he was like, well, how long have you had to have this meeting? I was like, a month. He was like, I want you to hang up the phone right now and have the meeting.
Oh, wow.
And it was the perfect instruction. And you're right. Like, get in there and do it. And the scariest part is getting in. And just because we get in there doesn't mean it's not going to be a problem. I mean, we might pick up the phone and it is bad news. Again, the goal is not to expose yourself to something because it will always be good and you'll always be wrong. Mm-hmm. The goal is to get used to not letting your fears stop you.
Right.
And some of us actually have a propensity to avoid anything we fear. I've actually been taking a step as the minute I identify something I'm afraid of, I try to do it.
Right.
I already have social anxiety. I'm an introvert. I'm hesitant. I'm low risk. That's just part of my personality. So I'm trying to always push and move toward exposure.
Right. Okay, that's great. So normalization, exposure, now habituation and care. So let's do habituation.
So habituation, another word to describe this, or another word to use for this is desensitization. So as you expose yourself to what you fear, you are becoming more habituated to it, or you are becoming less sensitive to the anxious thoughts and feelings. They're still there. They just don't stop you. Mm-hmm. You begin to tolerate it more. And so through repeated exposure, you develop a certain resilience to the anxiety. So the example I use in the book is, so I have asthma and I grew up with really bad asthma. And the doctor at one point told my dad a way to treat asthma is with steam. So he built like this little tent, this little plastic tent over the shower. And so I would go on, he'd turn on the hot water, turn on really hot, and then I'd go in there and have a steam. Well, the problem is I was like 8 years old. It's a hot shower. And it felt terrible just to be in there. Now, all I do is take hot showers because I got used to it. I become less sensitive to it. My friend's a musician, and I wanted to learn to play guitar. And so I got a guitar and I started playing guitar, and I stopped after one day. And my friend, he was like, why? Why did you stop? I said, it hurts. Playing guitar hurts. Strumming, that hurts. He was like, well, yeah, you haven't done it enough to build calluses, because you got to build calluses on your finger if you're going to be doing that. So it's kind of like becoming less sensitive to the kind of anxiety that I don't have to be paying attention to.
Right.
Of course, we can do it the opposite way. The New Testament actually says that we can become desensitized to sin. You know, you do bad things over and over again, and then your conscience doesn't feel them as much. This is the positive side,
Right.
where I'm saying I'm going to do something that makes me anxious, and then over time, it's not going to make me anxious.
And my hunch is when it comes to that exposure, everything is probably not, well, whatever you're fearful about, you should just go do it. In some cases, it's probably steps for some people of exposure. In other cases, it's, you know, picking up the phone might be simpler. Some other things maybe aren't quite as simple, depending on what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's where we kind of have to get strategic about it and be thoughtful about it. I have a friend of mine that is afraid of elevators. She doesn't ride in elevators and never does. And when she does, she gets into a complete panic. So she tries to avoid them at all costs. So she has a place that she goes every week and takes the stairs to get to the place. And I say, here's what I want you to do. Once a day, I want you to imagine yourself in an elevator for 60 seconds. They call that like cerebral exposure or something like that, you know? Just imagine yourself and then let yourself get a little anxious. And kind of be anxious for about 30 seconds and then kind of remind yourself that you're okay, you know? And then once you get used to that, I want you once a week to go to that place where the elevator is and sit outside and watch other people come in and out. And then once you're used to that, I want you to go into the elevator and then you can come out before the elevator closes. And then I want you to ride the elevator up and down. But I want you to ride it long enough to actually get anxious. And then talk yourself down, self-soothe. I mean, that's the discipline that really we have to get better at. Ideally, we learn that when we're infants and our parents kind of let us cry ourselves to sleep a little bit. We learn, I'm upset, and then I cannot be upset anymore. And then I can emotionally self-regulate, right? And so we've kind of lost some of the ability to do that. And so we're learning to do it again.
Yeah,
and that's
I love
what
that. I love that how you the exposure is self-soothing. And in some cases, some people would recognize when I was anxious, I soothe in unhealthy ways, which has led to whatever addiction I have or you know, whatever it might be. That's where a lot of addictions come from. Self-soothe. That's my understanding. And anyway, would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think that self-soothing is part of it. In fact, there's some writing and some research out there that say that might be some of the what we know about ADHD could actually be an attempt, a coping mechanism to deal with anxiety. Like at some point early on, I grew up in a chaotic home, or I grew up with a lot of chaos in my life, and I couldn't get out of it. So I learned to distract myself. And then now my brain has learned when I get stressed out, I distract myself. And now your brain is just distracting you on its own. And so, the skill of kind of backing up saying, okay, let me blame it on my brain here for a moment. You know, I don't have to shame myself. My brain is now doing something that I need to retrain it. And I am not my brain. You know, great book by Jeffrey Schwartz, You Are Not Your Brain. A great way of just saying, let me understand neurologically what's happening here. And then the last one is care. Care is how you take care of yourself. How's your eating? Are you exercising? Are you getting outside? Do you have breathing exercises? You know, breathing helps flood the body with oxygen. Do I relax? What is my work schedule? And then how do I talk to myself? And this goes into the spiritual stuff. Like, are the things that I'm saying to myself the kinds of things that God would say to me? Or am I saying things to myself that God's like, I would never say that to you? Our self-talk, our self-care, our self-compassion, all of these create that nurturing environment that makes self-soothing, makes exposure and habituation more manageable and helps us lean more into normalization. And so unfortunately, sometimes our spirituality can be detrimental. We can become obsessive with our spirituality, or our spirituality is very critical or negative. Maybe we grew up in settings where the scripts that we tell ourselves in our head or the Bible verses that we go to don't help us. I think that's one of the ones that when I first started dealing with anxiety, the only verses that I could see were "do not worry."
Right.
And or "do not be afraid." But really linguistically there in the original, what is it says, stop worrying, stop being afraid. And the tone is an invitation. It's not stop it. It's, hey, let's stop worrying. And then Paul just so beautifully says, let's stop worrying. Whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is lovely, let's think about these things. Same thing with Jesus. It's not, don't worry. It's, let's not be afraid. Have courage. I'm here with you. And so even the tone and the intention of those verses, that in our English and in our preaching, and maybe how we learned it in our, we're either taught it or caught it, can be very different than what God is saying to us. So that's where the care comes in.
So good. Okay, so just to recap for everybody: normalization, exposure, habituation, care. The kind of practical book is built kind of on these 4 pillars. Now, I want to talk just about a few of the 27 chapters, just a couple of them. One is you talk about putting limits on worry. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think when we're anxious, if we want to stop worrying, that creates more anxiety. It's kind of like telling ourselves to fall asleep, right. And now I can't fall asleep, right? So the research, as well as our own experiences dealing with anxiety, tells us that there is a place where we can give ourselves to worry, but it should be limited. So I recommend, if somebody's, I'm really worried about my job. Okay, then schedule some time to worry. Like, how about from 7 to 7:30 later tonight? Put it on the calendar, spend a good half hour worrying. And then when you're done, say, now I'm going to get back to what I am going to healthily do. And we give some time to it, allow it to be there, but don't let it take over. Give yourself some space. One of the recommendations that a lot of therapists recommend is, especially for teenagers, is create a worry box, where you could either do it in your mind or you can do it physically. They'll actually tell kids, okay, I want you to create a box, get a cardboard box. You can decorate it however you want. When you're worried about something, write down that worry, physically put it in the box. And then once a day, fish around in the box, pull it out, then worry about that thing for 5 or 10 minutes. And then if you feel like you're done with it, then throw it away. If you still, well, this is still a worry, put it back in the box. But again, it's the discipline of you taking control over your thoughts and feelings and how much time you're going to give them. This is why traditional talk therapy is not good for people with significant anxiety issues.
Because they're always talking about it.
I'm talking about it for an hour, and then I come back the next day and it's another hour. It's like, well, we can talk about it for an hour. My therapist, first time I met with him, he said, tell me what's going on. After 20 minutes, he was like, all right, I've had enough. I know what to do. And then he just started telling me things there. I was like, you don't let me talk more? He was like, that's just going to make you worry more. So that was kind of a new skill to learn, of a bit of self-mastery. Right. And again, part of it is that self-regulation.
So good. All right. Decoupling. That's another thing you talk about. And decoupling your thoughts and your actions kind of feels like a little bit of a therapy term. What does it mean? How does it work?
So the word decoupling, the first place I got that from was when I worked as a chaplain. We would often, when we were working with patients who were dying and their family members were connected with them in the grief process, especially when somebody's actively dying, there is a letting the person go and realizing I am not my family member. They are allowed to pass on. I am allowed to still be there. I ran across the same word when it came to anxiety treatment, particularly with obsessive compulsive disorder. Sometimes what we do is we attach our thinking with our actions in an unhealthy way. So let me give an example, and this comes from obsessive compulsive thinking. I can sit here and right now there's cars going by right outside my window right here. And I can imagine, wow, those cars are going by fast. What's it like? What would it be like if I walked out there? What if I got hit? In fact, what if I went out there because I wanted to get hit and then I got hit by a car? What would it be like to get hit by a car? Oh my gosh. Do I want to get hit by a car? I can't believe I thought about getting hit by a car. What kind of person am I that I want to get hit by a car? And so what happened is an intrusive thought or a random thought gets connected with the idea of an action, and then we've merged them. Just because you think something doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean you're going to do it, and doesn't mean you want to do it. And this goes back to the idea of intrusive thoughts. We human beings, we have intrusive thoughts all the time. Just most of us dismiss them.
Right.
Oh, man. In my area of the world where I'm living, earthquakes. Man, what if an earthquake leveled this house? You go, that'd be terrible. Okay, then I want to move on.
Right.
An anxious or obsessive person will spend the next hour worried about earthquakes.
Right.
And when a plane flies up, or they'll feel responsible. You know, it's funny. This is something that happens with some human beings. During 9/11 in the US, when the Twin Towers went down, there were interviews and trauma debriefing with people. And there were people in 9/11 that said, you know what? I have always been afraid that we would have a terrorist attack. In fact, I worried about a terrorist attack, and then it happened. And I kind of feel responsible because I was worried that was good. And you have people like connecting the two, and to work with them and say, actually, that's not how it works. Now, for some people who are listening to us right now, they're like, that's crazy thinking. But for others that are listening, you go, yep, I've done that before.
Yeah.
I do that. I connect
I've
my
seen
thoughts.
pastors do this. I've seen pastors do this when people get job transfers.
Yes.
And they move to another city, and the pastors, this is true pastor, one pastor to another now talking, but the pastor says, oh, they left the church because of me. But they didn't leave at all because of them. They got transferred, like it's a job transfer.
Right.
And it's like, oh yeah, I must have done something, like, and it has actually nothing to do with them.
Right. Even if the person says, I didn't have anything to do with it, it didn't have anything to do with you, then you go, yeah, but I think it did. And then you feel that.
It's crazy.
And then your brain goes, you might be right.
Yeah, you're the problem. You're the problem.
Yes. And it has to do with the stickiness of thoughts and feelings. Thoughts and feelings are very sticky. Mm-hmm. And our challenge is to think with our thinking and feel with our feelings. And being very careful when they enmesh. Just because you thought it doesn't mean you did it. And you know, the example that comes to me real clearly is dreams.
Right.
You know, you have a dream, and unless you're having very lucid dreams and you're able to be active and make choices in your dreams, a lot of time your brain is thinking things and you wake up and you go, that was the weirdest thing ever. Mm-hmm. Some people wake up and feel guilty for the dreams they had. Oh, does this represents who I really am? And of course, decades of Freudian psychology would say, yes, that's exactly who you are. But we understand that it's possible to have a random thought. Now, what we do with that thought is different, because Jesus says that like if you lust after a person, then you've committed adultery in your heart. But people experience sexualized thoughts at different times in their life. That doesn't mean that you did something wrong. It's what you do with that thought afterwards.
Right. Right.
So that's that decoupling.
So good. Okay. I want to, that's so helpful. Now, talk to me about anxiety and teenagers. I want to just talk to you about that, and then we're going to talk about the spiritual side. But I just know that there are so many teenagers at our church who are really connecting with this series, and their parents are connecting with the series. When you're a teenager and you're struggling with anxiety and you're kind of in the early struggle, what advice do you give the teenager? What advice do you give a parent in that situation?
Let me start with the parent, because the kind of atmosphere we create in the home is so instrumental for the mental wellness and health of our kids. And I know I got 3 kids, and all 3 of them have dealt with anxiety and different things like that. That's where the normalization comes in. There's nothing wrong with you because you're struggling with anxiety. This is okay. You are loved. It's all right. We can get through this. The kind of encouragement, and not the quick fixes, but creating that safe atmosphere where, I mean, to your credit, even the series you're doing, where it's okay to not be okay.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, spiritually, we see so many examples of some of the most significant figures that people look up to in the Bible dealing with anxiety. Jesus himself, I mean, the night he was arrested, it says that he was sweating drops of blood, probably broken blood vessels in his forehead as signs of traumatic stress. So we have Jesus himself, God in the flesh, experiencing all the emotional, mental, and physiological symptoms of stress and trauma. So we have all of that stuff, and creating atmosphere to say it's okay that you're dealing with this, and we can get you help. And then being able to connect them with somebody that really understands anxiety and anxiety treatment, and educating them on some of the basics. I think for students, a big source of that will be monitoring input, because like those algorithms, I think one of the reasons we have such an explosion in anxiety is because of the amount of information we're exposed to that we have no ability to control.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you think about it, I mean, 100 years ago, the information you got was whatever people in your neighborhood told you. And if you wanted to do something about it, you just go down in the neighborhood and figure it out. And when newspapers came in, you were now learning things, for the most part, that were local. But once news expanded, news from around the world, suddenly I got information about stuff that I actually have no participation in.
Right.
Now, the amount of information that you can get in 20 minutes that you actually have no control over is insane. So I think monitoring some of that and teaching some self-control and some wisdom and some good practices about social media and about content is really, really important. And that includes self-care, like even sleeping well. And it's very common for people to scroll before they're going to bed or scroll when they wake up. The content you're getting before you go to sleep or right when you wake up actually shapes, how you think. So that, and like I said, getting them connected with somebody that can talk through some of these basic principles of normalization and exposure and desensitization and care, to begin helping them own some of their anxiety. My own kids have seen a therapist that specializes in this, and in the beginning they were seeing them often, and now it's spread out a little bit more because now they're learning to, like you said in the beginning, learn to a little bit more tolerate the anxiety without the same level of distress.
Mm-hmm. And as you talked about, they're getting tools, they're getting habits, and you've talked about so many really practical ones. Let's talk about kind of spiritual practices. We're talking about the spiritual side of mental health as a part of the series. Really, out of my feeling that there's so much out there on the physical side and the neurological side, and psychologists have a lot to say about mental health, and all these things are super helpful. But the spiritual side doesn't get talked about very much. What are kind of some of the places you've seen spiritual practices really help people when it comes to anxiety and their mental health?
There's a few. One, I would say the spiritual practice of Sabbath, and that is related physiologically, but there's something else going on there. The idea of Sabbath is I'm going to take intentional times to be non-productive. And what that does, by building that into a rhythm, that could be a portion of time during the day where I'm going to decide I'm not going to think about things. I'm not going to problem solve. I'm not going to try to accomplish a task. That is an intentional forcing of non-productivity, which in our culture is a source of anxiety because we usually connect our productivity with our value.
Right.
So
Right.
by me taking a moment or an extended period of time to choose to be non-productive, I'm actually pushing against my values. And what I have to say to myself in that time is that God values me even when I'm not producing. Now, that's a worldview shift for some people, but God has actually recommended, and at least in Old Testament Israel, prescribed Sabbath as a rhythm. And so I think that's a discipline that gets us used to relaxing and not equating our value with our productivity. So that's one of them. I think another one is prayer. And by prayer, I mean either scripted prayer, because some of us with anxiety, we just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and we're waiting for the release of, oh, I feel like I'm done talking,
Right.
like, oh, I got it out. And for those of us with strong anxiety, that never happens. There is a form of obsessive compulsive disorder that is related to prayer. Just real quickly, the idea of obsessive compulsive disorder is I have an obsession. I have something I'm obsessing about. And then there's something I compulsively do to get rid of the obsession.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we chase prayer like that. I'm praying. I'm obsessed with God hearing me, and I will pray until I get the feeling that God has heard me. That's why the Lord's Prayer is just a beautiful prayer. You pray it and you're done. This is how Jesus said to pray. I'm done. And now I have to deal with the doneness of it. The other side of prayer is the ability to actually tell God exactly what we're feeling, thinking, even if it's messy. Some of us are afraid, anxious, to be honest with God. And the best thing we can do is expose ourselves to a form of prayer where we're just honest with God.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the Psalms of the Bible, where it's like, God, where are you? You've abandoned me.
Mm-hmm.
And being open to saying that. And that can be its own form of exposure and deeply spiritual. And Jesus himself models that kind of honesty with God. I think the other one, and I would say I don't know if I'd associate this with a spiritual discipline, but I do think it's an element of spirituality, and that is learning to tolerate uncertainty. In Western culture, in Western Christian culture, there's a bit of obsession about information and certainty. If you have a problem, you can go online and find the answer. If you have a feeling and you don't like that feeling, then you can find an answer to get rid of that feeling. And that's actually not Christian. The Christian spirituality is, it's actually a lot of mystery. There's a lot of things we have questions about. And we can say, well, there's this, and there's this, and then there's this. And I don't know. I was just teaching a class this morning, and people were saying, what's your view on this? And I was like, well, here's one view that I've read, and here's another view I've read, and here's another view I've read. And they said, which one's right? And I was like, we don't know. And they were not happy with that answer, because it's like, oh, that gives me anxiety. So there's something about learning to tolerate uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
That is deeply, deeply spiritual. And when you look at the most spiritually mature, I would say in my life, when I look at the Christians, the followers of Jesus that are most spiritually mature, they are able to tolerate large portions of uncertainty.
So good.
And they don't get distressed by it. Well, don't you know about this and that? What do you know about this? Yeah, I don't know. And I'm like, that doesn't bother you? and they've learned that, and so I want to learn that, to be able to tolerate more of that. Now, it doesn't mean you don't know anything. We certainly know a lot, but I think sometimes in our Western Bible tradition churches, there's such a value on certainty that it chases us toward more book reading and more Bible reading, and we become kind of really driven by Bible study, almost with the idea that if we had enough Bible study, then we will be certain of the spiritual things. And then we extrapolate it. I mean, not to go off on anything, but we go, well, when I die and go in heaven, then I'll understand everything. What, really? So now we become omniscient in heaven? Why would I think? Maybe I actually go to heaven and I won't need to know there, kind of like I don't need to know here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that uncertainty has been a big thing, at least for me in my journey.
Right. Oh, so good. So good. Okay. Yeah. And you got me thinking on the prayer side, my prayer life from an anxiety standpoint, I would pray and pray and pray. And I bet you I was praying the same things over and over again. And what happened was I started journaling, and the journaling turned into the prayer, but I have to write 3 pages. It's an exercise called morning pages. So I can't write more than 3, but I can't write less than 3. I have to write 3, which really puts a beginning and an end and pushes me when I need to process more with God.
Oh, that's good.
And stops me when I need to process less. But to me, it was journaling. I never thought of it as prayer until you actually talked about it now. That is what I'm doing. It's kind of like, hey, God, here's what I'm anxious about. So that's really helpful.
It's so good too, because it activates such a different area of the brain and the spirit by writing it. Whereas talking, you can kind of lose yourself in the talking, versus writing, you're kind of codifying it, and you're actually seeing what you said earlier. Sometimes when I'm talking, I don't remember what I just said, especially when I'm praying. Whereas there's kind of a different prayer process in the journaling experience that could be uniquely helpful to some people. Other people, they might be like, no, that doesn't help me. It gets me obsessed because I'm like, who's going to read this? I can't be honest about it, right? But so that's wonderful. Yeah, journaling is super good. Wow.
Yeah, you put some real language around. That's helpful. Okay. If you are listening to this and you're like, I need to see a professional, connexuschurch.com/counselor will give you some local counselors to Connexus. So just want to mention that. And then just want to ask you, Jason, one last thing. Somebody who's listening to this today and says, I'm just exhausted with my anxiety. I just want it to go away. It's tiring me out. I would just love for you to speak to that person for a moment.
Yeah. Oh, I know how that feels on a regular basis. In fact, sometimes even trying to work on our anxiety is exhausting. I have this phrase that I use, exposure hangovers, that where you're actually, when you're facing your anxiety, it's exhausting and it's tiring. I think those of us with anxiety that are actively living in it, it feels like a full-time or a part-time job. And I just want to say, this isn't your fault. You are loved, and there's hope. You're going to get through this. We just need to find the right people around you that can remind you you're going to be okay. And then it's really an invitation to a new set of skills. It's kind of like when the Bible says, if anyone is in Christ, they're a new creature. They're part of the new creation. I think what we're hoping for with this is a new experience with your thoughts and feelings. And there's a lot of hope. You can get through this, but it might mean doing things you've never done before and thinking about things the way you haven't thought about them before. And there's hope. And I want to encourage you in that, because I've been down that road. I do have those anxious nights. I do get tired, but it's something that we can actually experience change about. You don't have to live with this the way you're living with it right now. So I just want to encourage you. Don't just hang in there. Let's get you some help.
Love it. There's hope. Love it. Thank you, Jason. This has been so fantastic. And we just really appreciate your time and writing the book, Anxiety Field Guide. And yeah, just thanks so much for all you're doing for those who listen to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks for all the work you're doing. Appreciate you, brother.